What if Anakin Skywalker made the one choice Darth Sidious never saw coming? What if, the instant he learned the Supreme Chancellor was the Sith Lord manipulating the entire galaxy, he didn't hesitate, he didn't report him, he simply ignited his lightsaber and struck. One decision would save the Jedi from one nightmare, but unleash a future no one, not even Anakin, could have imagined.
The moment the Sith Lord revealed himself, Anakin Skywalker understood that everything he had built was a lie. They were alone in Palpatine's private chambers, the Chancellor's personal sanctuary, decorated with artifacts that suggested culture and refinement and the specific aesthetic of power that had nothing to do with Force sensitivity. Palpatine sat behind his desk with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed they held absolute authority over everyone in their presence, and he had just finished explaining to Anakin exactly how the Jedi had been manipulated, how the clone army had been programmed, how Order 66 would activate and eliminate the entire Jedi Order simultaneously. "So you see," Palpatine said, his voice carrying something that might have been affection or might have been the specific satisfaction that came from watching a plan come to fruition, "you have been essential to this design. Your fear of loss, your desire to save Padme, your ambition beyond the limitations of the Jedi Order, these have been the instruments through which I have shaped you." He stood from his desk and walked toward Anakin with the unhurried grace of someone who had never encountered opposition he could not immediately dominate. "I am Darth Sidious," Palpatine said, and his voice changed. Something old and terrible emerged from beneath the civilized Chancellor's affect. "And you, Anakin Skywalker, are my greatest achievement, the perfect synthesis of Jedi training and Sith ambition, the being I have spent decades cultivating." The moment stretched. Anakin's hand did not move to his lightsaber. His breathing did not accelerate. His expression did not shift into anger or shock or the desperation that Palpatine seemed to expect. What happened instead was worse. Anakin's consciousness simply clarified, not through meditation, not through careful Jedi discipline, through the specific clarity that comes when everything you believed about yourself is revealed to be manipulation, when every choice you thought you made is revealed to have been orchestrated, when the person you thought you were serving is revealed to have been serving himself through you. Anakin saw suddenly, with absolute precision, exactly what Palpatine was, not the Chancellor, not the mentor, not the being who understood him better than the Jedi Order. Anakin saw the Sith Lord, the being who had been using him as tool, who had been shaping him as weapon, who had been preparing to discard him the moment he was no longer useful. And Anakin understood something else with equal clarity. He was more powerful than Palpatine expected him to be in this moment, because Palpatine was expecting capitulation. Palpatine was expecting the Anakin who was conflicted, the Anakin who wanted power, the Anakin who feared loss and would accept manipulation in exchange for the illusion of control. Palpatine was not expecting the Anakin who suddenly understood that he had been played, and who responded not with emotional reaction, but with absolute tactical assessment. "You are correct about one thing," Anakin said quietly, and his voice carried the specific steadiness that came from having nothing left to lose. "You have shaped me, but you made critical error in your shaping." Palpatine's expression shifted slightly. First indication that this conversation was not proceeding according to his anticipation. "You taught me to be powerful," Anakin continued, his hand moving toward his lightsaber with the specific slowness that communicated intention rather than urgency. "You taught me that strength meant accepting dominance over others. You taught me that the Sith philosophy represented transcendence beyond the Jedi's limitations, and you were partially correct. But you failed to account for one variable." "What variable?" Palpatine asked, and his voice still carried confidence, but the confidence was now edged with something that might have been curiosity or might have been the first moment of genuine miscalculation. "That I would choose clarity over power," Anakin replied, and he activated his lightsaber. The blade ignited with a sound that cut through the chamber like promise of violence, but more significantly, it ignited with absolute commitment. No hesitation, no internal conflict, no part of Anakin still attached to the illusion of partnership with the Sith Lord. Palpatine's response was immediate and absolute. The Sith Lord's hands moved, and force power exploded through the chamber. Lightning that crackled across furniture, that shattered artifacts, that filled the space with energy that was ancient and terrible and absolutely merciless. The lightning came not as attack, but as assertion of dominance, as immediate demonstration that Anakin was facing an opponent of incomprehensible power. But Anakin had spent years being trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi to move through impossible situations with impossible grace. And more significantly, Anakin was no longer fighting from desperation or from the emotional conflict that had always characterized his engagements. Anakin was fighting from clarity. He moved through the lightning with movements that should not have been possible, his lightsaber raised in perfect defensive positioning, every gesture designed to deflect the energy that was being discharged at him. The lightning hit his blade and scattered, bounced back, filled the chamber with the specific electromagnetic violence that came from force energy meeting physical blade. Palpatine's expression shifted into something that might have been genuine surprise. This was not the confrontation he had anticipated. This was not the Anakin he had spent decades cultivating. This was Anakin Skywalker at full power, fully trained, absolutely focused, fighting without the internal conflicts that Palpatine had been counting on as weakness. The Sith Lord moved from defensive posturing into aggressive assault. His hands extended, and force power exploded outward in patterns designed to overwhelm, designed to disorient, designed to force Anakin into positions where the lightning could find its mark. The assault was genuine. Palpatine understood suddenly that this confrontation could result in his elimination if he did not move beyond psychological dominance into actual combat supremacy. But Anakin was prepared for this too, not because anyone had taught him to fight a Sith Lord of Palpatine's caliber, but because every confrontation he had survived in the Clone Wars had been teaching him exactly how to move through situations where he was facing power that exceeded his own. Every impossible engagement had been preparation for this single moment. Anakin threw his arm upward, and the Force responded, not as manipulation of external objects, but as expression of his own will, channeled through the Force itself. His power met Palpatine's power in the middle of the chamber, and the collision of two beings operating at peak capability created shockwave that cracked transparasteel windows, that shattered remaining artifacts, that made the very air itself seem to scream. Palpatine was forced backward. The movement was minor, a single step, nothing more, but it was acknowledgement that Anakin's counterattack had met the Sith Lord's assault with sufficient force to create momentary equilibrium. Momentary was enough. Anakin moved forward with his lightsaber raised, and his strike was not designed to kill. It was designed to open space, to force Palpatine into defensive posturing, to establish that this engagement was no longer psychological warfare, but was actual combat between two beings of comparable power. Palpatine's lightsaber activated. The blade that ignited was red, a color that suggested ancient dyes, suggested power channeled through will and desire, and absolute commitment to dominance. It was weapon designed to hurt, designed to dominate, designed to express Sith philosophy through physical form. It met Anakin's blade with force that sent both combatants backward slightly, that made the chamber itself seem to vibrate with the weight of collision. "You have been trained well," Palpatine said, and his voice carried respect, mixed with something that might have been rage or might have been the specific focus that came from genuine opponent providing genuine challenge. "But training is not sufficient against experience, and I have millennia of experience." "Experience that made you arrogant," Anakin replied, moving into aggressive positioning that forced Palpatine to raise his blade in immediate defense. "Experience that made you believe that anyone you had shaped was automatically subordinate. Experience that made you forget that the beings you manipulate are still beings, and beings are capable of clarity that transcends manipulation." The engagement intensified. Palpatine's strikes came from angles that should not have been possible, from positions that suggested mastery of combat geometry that exceeded standard training. His blade moved with precision that was almost supernatural, with speed that was designed to overwhelm through sheer technical superiority. But Anakin was not simply trained in technical combat. Anakin had been trained in adaptability. Anakin had been trained in the specific clarity that came from surviving confrontations where he was outmatched. And Anakin had been trained by opponents who did not believe he could survive. He moved through Palpatine's assault not by matching technique with technique, but by understanding the philosophy beneath the technique and responding to philosophy rather than to mechanical strike pattern. Where Palpatine attacked through precision, Anakin defended through adaptation. Where Palpatine moved with mathematical certainty, Anakin moved with intuitive flow, and slowly, incrementally, Anakin began to press Palpatine backward. The Sith Lord understood what was happening with the clarity that came from millennia of combat experience. Palpatine understood that this engagement was not proceeding according to anticipation. Understood that this Anakin was not the conflicted, manipulated being that had been cultivated. Understood that something fundamental had shifted the moment Anakin had chosen clarity over the comfort of manipulation. Palpatine's response was to push the engagement into territory where his experience would matter more than Anakin's adaptive capability. The Sith Lord deployed force power in patterns that were designed to overload sensory perception, that were designed to create disorientation through assault on the Force sensitivity itself. His lightning became more intense, more focused, more designed to penetrate physical defense through sheer overwhelming force. But Anakin had one advantage that Palpatine was not accounting for. Anakin was no longer afraid. The fear of loss that had defined so much of Anakin's existence, the fear of being left behind, the fear of inadequacy, all of those fears had been instruments through which Palpatine had maintained control. And in the moment where Anakin had understood the full scope of manipulation, those fears had been replaced by something cleaner. Simple clarity about what needed to happen. Anakin's blade found opening in Palpatine's defense, not because the Sith Lord had become slow or because Anakin's technique had suddenly improved, but because Palpatine had overcommitted to the Force assault, had believed that overwhelming power would be sufficient, had not accounted for opponent who would simply accept the lightning and move through it anyway. The blade came upward in strike, designed not to kill immediately, but to wound, to open space, to demonstrate that the engagement had shifted from Palpatine's control into genuine confrontation between equals. Palpatine's hand came up to block, and the collision of blade and hand sent force energy cascading through the chamber, with violence that shattered remaining fixtures, that cracked the walls themselves, that made the space seem to collapse inward from the weight of two beings operating at absolute peak power. But in that moment of collision, in that moment where Palpatine's focus was divided between defending against the blade and maintaining his Force assault, Anakin made a decision that changed everything. He did not attempt to kill Palpatine in traditional sense. Instead, Anakin deployed his own Force power not externally, but internally, channeling it through his own body, through his own connection to the Force, through his own will. He pulled everything, every ounce of power, every connection, every fragment of Force sensitivity into single moment of absolute assertion. His lightsaber came forward, not as weapon, but as extension of his will, and it found the gap in Palpatine's defense that the Sith Lord had not believed existed. The blade entered Palpatine's chest, not deeply. The Sith Lord's physical ability to move was sufficient to prevent complete penetration, but deeply enough that the lightsaber's plasma core cauterized the wound immediately, deeply enough that damage was done that could not be immediately healed, deeply enough that Palpatine understood suddenly and with complete clarity that he was dying. The Sith Lord fell, not dramatically, not with acknowledgement of defeat, but simply as body gives up when vital systems are compromised. Palpatine hit the floor of his own chambers, and his hand moved to the wound in his chest, with the specific gesture of someone trying to understand what had just occurred. Anakin stood over him, lightsaber still activated, and his expression carried no triumph, no satisfaction, no emotional response whatsoever. Simply absolute clarity about what had just happened. "You taught me to be powerful," Anakin said to the Sith Lord who was dying on his own floor. "But you failed to teach me that power without purpose is simply cruelty. And you taught me everything I needed to know to refuse that lesson." Palpatine's breathing slowed. His hand fell away from the wound. And the being who had spent centuries manipulating the galaxy, who had orchestrated the Clone Wars, who had positioned himself as inevitable, that being was simply gone. The Chancellor of the Republic lay dead in his private chambers, killed not by Jedi Knight acting from righteousness, but by the being he had spent decades cultivating, acting from absolute clarity about what needed to happen, and nothing would ever be the same. The body was discovered by Palpatine's security detail when the Chancellor failed to attend the afternoon Senate session. Commander Fox, head of the Coruscant Guard, found his Supreme Commander dead in the private chambers with a lightsaber wound and no apparent signs of struggle, which was the most terrifying discovery possible because it meant whoever had done this had not needed to struggle. It meant the Chancellor had been killed by someone who was faster, stronger, and more decisive than the most powerful man in the galaxy should have needed to account for. Fox's response was immediate: seal the chambers, alert the military command structure, and initiate protection protocols for government officials who might be at risk. What Fox did not do, what he could not have anticipated needing to do, was arrest Anakin Skywalker. Because Anakin had walked out of the Chancellor's chambers, had reported to the Jedi Temple, and had requested immediate audience with Yoda and the assembled council. And he had done all of this with the specific calm of someone who had made decision and was now accepting consequences with absolute clarity. The council chamber erupted the moment Anakin finished explaining what had occurred. "You killed the Chancellor?" Mace Windu's voice cut across the chamber like blade, sharp and clean, and carrying disbelief that suggested his mind was refusing to process the information his ears were receiving. "You murdered the sitting Chancellor of the Republic?" "I killed a Sith Lord," Anakin corrected, and his voice carried no defensiveness, no justification, no emotional component whatsoever. Palpatine revealed his true nature. He explained how he had been manipulating me, how the clone army was compromised, how Order 66 would activate and eliminate the Jedi. He was in process of consolidating power specifically designed to destroy the Order. I responded by eliminating the threat. "And the fact that he was the Chancellor?" Ki-Adi-Mundi demanded. "The fact that killing him is essentially an act of war against the government you swore to protect? Does not change the fundamental reality," Anakin replied. "A Sith Lord was in control of the Republic's military apparatus. A Sith Lord was positioning the clone army as genocide weapon against the Jedi. The political status of his position is secondary to the strategic reality of what he was." Obi-Wan Kenobi, standing to the side of the chamber, understood what Anakin was not saying. The young Jedi Knight had made decision based on absolute clarity, had executed that decision with perfect precision, and was now accepting full responsibility for consequences without attempting to justify or explain away what he had done. It was the most terrifying thing Obi-Wan had witnessed in years. "The military knows the Chancellor is dead," Yoda said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of someone already calculating cascading consequences. "Know they will, within the hour, that Jedi were involved in his death. Know the Senate will, within hours, that the Jedi have allegedly committed assassination of government official. The political consequences of this action will be catastrophic. Then we move quickly," Anakin said simply. "We present evidence of Palpatine's Sith nature. We explain the clone army conspiracy. We provide justification that the Senate cannot refuse to acknowledge." "And if the Senate refuses to acknowledge," Mace demanded, "if the Senate views this as Jedi power grab, if the military sees this as opportunity to move against the Jedi Order using the clone forces that are still, at this very moment, distributed throughout the Republic, then we were going to face that situation regardless," Anakin replied. "The only variable my action changed was the timeline. Palpatine was preparing to activate Order 66. I simply made activation happen on terms slightly more favorable to the Jedi. The Senate session that convened 2 hours later was chaos. The announcement of the Chancellor's death had spread through Coruscant's political structures with the specific velocity that tragedy always carried. Senators who had been in offices were rushing to the chamber. Military commanders were demanding explanations. News networks were broadcasting speculation about who could possibly have killed the most protected being in the galaxy. And then Anakin Skywalker walked into the chamber with evidence. The holographic displays showed everything: Palpatine's communications with Dooku, financial trails that led to Sith holdings, clone army programming specifications that demonstrated the conspiracy with absolute clarity. Anakin presented it with the precision of someone who was not attempting to convince through emotion, but through fact. The being you called Chancellor was a Sith Lord, Anakin stated, his voice carrying across the chamber with authority that suggested he was beyond needing anyone's permission to speak. He has spent decades manipulating the Republic toward his purposes. He has positioned the clone army as genocide weapon against the Jedi Order. The military apparatus you believe you control is actually under his direct command. Senator Bail Organa stood from his seat. And your evidence for these claims is documented in every file you are currently observing, Anakin replied. Examine them, verify them. The evidence is available for complete scrutiny. The chamber descended into chaos. Senators arguing, military commanders demanding explanations, government officials questioning the authenticity of the evidence and the motivation behind it. But slowly, incrementally, the evidence began to be believed, not because the Senate wanted to believe it, but because the evidence was irrefutable. The clone army programming was real, the Sith connections were real, the conspiracy was real, and the killing of Palpatine was beginning to be understood not as assassination, but as elimination of threat to the Republic itself. But the political situation was not resolved, it was simply transformed. The military response came faster than anyone anticipated. Commander Fox, following protocols that made sense in context of the Chancellor's death, but which took on sinister implications when the evidence of Sith conspiracy became known, issued orders to arrest Anakin Skywalker for the murder of the Chancellor. The arrest was not subtle. Clone troopers surrounded the Jedi Temple. Military forces took positions throughout the Senate district. The message was clear. Regardless of whether Palpatine had been Sith, regardless of whether he had been manipulating the Republic, his death had been murder committed by Jedi, and the military was not going to allow that crime to go unpunished. Anakin did not resist when the clone troopers approached him. He simply stood in the temple's main courtyard, lightsaber deactivated, and allowed himself to be restrained. His expression carried no defiance, no concern, no emotional component, simply acceptance of consequence, following directly from choice. Obi-Wan intervened immediately, moving between Anakin and the clone squad with the authority that came from being senior Jedi Master, and from understanding that what was about to happen could not be allowed. Commander Fox, Obi-Wan said, his voice carrying the specific tone of someone who was not requesting but was stating fact. Anakin Skywalker acted with authorization of the Jedi Council to eliminate a Sith threat to the Republic. His actions were legal under the Emergency Powers Act. You are not authorized to arrest him. The Chancellor is dead, Fox replied, and his voice carried confusion mixed with military discipline. Regardless of circumstances, the being who killed him must be held accountable. The Chancellor was a Sith Lord, Obi-Wan responded. That fact supersedes the protocols you are attempting to follow. Stand down, Commander, or we will be forced to defend ourselves, and neither of us wants that outcome. The standoff lasted approximately 3 minutes. Then Fox received transmission through his clone communicator, orders from military command structure that, upon examination of the evidence, suggested that the situation was far more complex than simple arrest protocol. The orders were to stand down, to allow the Jedi to maintain custody of Anakin Skywalker pending investigation, and to await clarification from the new government authorities. Fox and his troops withdrew, but the message was clear. The military was not going to be easily convinced that the Jedi had acted appropriately. The military was going to require substantial justification for why the Chancellor's killer was being allowed to walk free. In the council chamber that evening, with the immediate crisis temporarily contained but the larger political situation still entirely unresolved, Anakin stood before the assembled masters and accepted the reality of what his choice had created. "You have killed the Chancellor of the Republic," Yoda said, and his voice was not accusatory, simply stating fact. "Known you must that consequences of this action will be ongoing. Hunted, you may be. Executed, you might be, if the political situation shifts against the Jedi. Accept this, you must." "I do accept it," Anakin replied. "I made choice knowing the cost. I am not asking for protection from that cost. But protection you will receive," Yoda continued. "The Jedi Order does not sacrifice its own to political convenience. Defend you, we will. But prepare also, we must, for war. Against the military, against the government, against the institutions that Palpatine had positioned for exactly this situation." Mace Windu voiced what everyone was thinking. Palpatine's death did not end the conspiracy. It accelerated it. The Sith Lord planned for contingencies against his own elimination. "We are walking into exactly the trap he designed." "Then we walk into it with clarity," Anakin said. "We move against the clone army immediately. We begin removal of the inhibitor chips before the military can prevent us from doing so. We seize the initiative before Palpatine's contingencies can activate. Aggressive," Ki-Adi-Mundi observed, "but potentially the only viable strategy." Obi-Wan understood what was unfolding. Anakin's decision to kill Palpatine had been based on clarity and correctness about the immediate threat. But that decision had set in motion consequences that would define the next years of Jedi history. The young Jedi Knight had not simply eliminated a Sith Lord. He had fundamentally transformed the trajectory of the Republic's future, and the consequences would be severe, far-reaching, and absolutely irreversible. Palpatine's contingencies were more sophisticated than anyone anticipated. The first indication came when Clone Force commanders across a dozen sectors received dual orders, one purporting to come from the new military command structure authorizing stand-down, and another from encrypted channels that traced back to locations within Palpatine's network that were supposed to have been secured. The encrypted orders had only one instruction: activate Protocol 66. The clone army began to move, not simultaneously. The encryption had been deliberately designed to activate in cascading waves across different theaters of operation, ensuring that no single military response could contain the activation. The first wave hit the Jedi Temple exactly 72 hours after Palpatine's death. Anakin was in the training chambers when the alarms sounded. The sound was different from standard security alerts. It was the specific frequency that indicated military assault on the temple itself. Anakin's response was immediate. He deactivated the training drone he'd been working with and moved toward the temple's upper levels with the speed that came from understanding what the alarm meant. Clone troopers were pouring through the temple's main entrance, not in small squads designed for infiltration, in full battalions designed for overwhelming assault. They moved with the specific coordination of soldiers who had been programmed for this exact scenario, who understood the temple's layout, who knew the defensive positions and were deliberately moving to overwhelm them before organized resistance could form. Anakin activated his lightsaber and moved to intercept the advancing line. "Get the younger Jedi to the evacuation points," he commanded to Obi-Wan, who appeared beside him with his own blade activated. "Clear the archives. Move everyone who cannot fight to the secondary passages." "We're not leaving you," Obi-Wan replied, and his stance communicated that he was prepared to hold this position regardless of orders. "You're not leaving me," Anakin agreed. "You're following tactical necessity. The temple can be rebuilt. The younger generation cannot." "Move." Obi-Wan hesitated for a fraction of a second, understanding in that moment that Anakin had accepted the cost of his choice completely and was now moving forward with absolute commitment to consequences, then turned and began directing evacuation. Anakin faced the clone advance with his lightsaber raised. The engagement that followed was brutal and precise in equal measure. Clone troopers fired with the coordination of soldiers who had trained for years in this specific scenario. Anakin moved through the blaster fire with the grace that came from decades of combat experience, his blade cutting through assault patterns, his movement designed not to win through overwhelming the enemy, but to maintain position long enough for evacuation to complete. Clone trooper after clone trooper fell. But for every one that fell, 3 more advanced. The assault was not designed to be won through individual combat skill. It was designed to overwhelm through sheer numerical superiority and coordinated assault pattern. Yoda appeared at the upper-level railing, his ancient form moving with speed that belied 900 years of age. The ancient master raised his hand, and force power exploded downward in patterns designed to disrupt the clone assault, to scatter the formation, to create space where the temple's defenders could establish coherent resistance. But the clone advance did not stop. It simply adapted. The battalions split, moving through multiple passages simultaneously, flanking the temple's defenders, creating situation where no single defensive position was tenable. The assault was methodical and absolute, and designed specifically to eliminate the Jedi Order through overwhelming military force. Mace Windu appeared from the side passages with additional Jedi Masters. The assembled defenders formed coherent defensive line that held the main courtyard against clone advance, creating situation where neither side could achieve decisive victory, but where the Jedi were being ground down through attrition. "We cannot hold this position," Ki-Adi-Mundi shouted over the sound of blaster fire and lightsaber strikes. "The evacuation is complete. We need to withdraw before we become completely surrounded." Anakin understood that he was being given exit, that the older masters were creating space for him to survive, and he understood also that accepting that exit meant abandoning the temple to clone destruction, meant watching the institution that had defined Jedi philosophy for 10,000 years be systematically dismantled. But sometimes, survival required accepting that loss was preferable to death. Anakin and the remaining masters fought their way toward the secondary passages, abandoning the temple in organized retreat that was almost as coordinated as the clone assault had been. Behind them, the clone forces moved through the temple's corridors, executing program directive to eliminate all Jedi and secure all knowledge archives for transfer to military command. The political situation on Coruscant was simultaneously escalating and fragmenting. The Senate, upon learning that the clone army had initiated armed assault on the Jedi Temple, divided immediately into factions. Senator Bail Organa and his allies moved to formally censure the military action and demand restoration of civilian government control. But the military command structure, claiming to operate on emergency powers that Palpatine had granted before his death, refused to accept Senate authority and instead declared martial law. The Republic was fracturing into civil conflict, not because anyone had desired it, but because the contingencies that the Sith Lord had installed were executing exactly as designed. News networks broadcast footage of clone troopers attacking the Jedi Temple. Public opinion fractured between those who viewed the Jedi as dangerous power seekers who had assassinated the Chancellor and those who viewed the clone assault as evidence of government instability. Street riots began erupting in sectors aligned with different political positions. Military forces moved to suppress the riots, which only accelerated the cycle of conflict. Commander Fox, receiving conflicting orders from military command and from Senate authorities, made decision that reflected his fundamental training. He sided with the institutional military structure, rather than with civilian government. The Coruscant Guard, which had been the one force maintaining any semblance of order, instead became enforcement mechanism for the military's assertion of power. Within 48 hours of the clone assault on the temple, the government of the Republic was effectively divided between military control and Senate resistance, with civilian authority being steadily eroded by military necessity and emergency protocols. In a secret location in the Outer Rim, a contingency activation began to broadcast. The transmission was from Palpatine, a recorded message scheduled to activate in the moment of his death, designed to reach every Sith operatic and agent he had positioned throughout the galaxy over decades of manipulation. "If you are receiving this message, I am dead," the recording began, Palpatine's voice carrying something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been the specific calm that came from understanding that even elimination had been accounted for. "I have been eliminated by Jedi intervention, but my death was not failure. My death was part of design. The clone army will have been activated. The Jedi will be under assault. The government of the Republic will be fragmenting under weight of civil conflict." The message continued with operational directives, coordinates of hidden Sith installations, financial accounts that contained substantial resources, instructions for agents to move into positions of power that the fracturing government was creating. "The galaxy will burn briefly," Palpatine's recording explained. "But from that burning will emerge new order, an order that I have positioned you to lead. My death removes me from direct command, but removes also my limitations. You will operate without central authority constraining you. You will build the future that I have architected. You will ensure that from my destruction emerges not restoration of what was, but creation of something entirely new." The message concluded with final instruction. "The Jedi will attempt to resist. The Senate will attempt to maintain government. The military will attempt to consolidate power. All of these efforts will fail because I have ensured that no single faction has sufficient power to dominate the others. You will emerge victorious not through superior strength, but through willingness to accept chaos while others are desperate for order." The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, operatives who had been positioned decades ago began to move in coordinated action that suggested Palpatine's death had been the activation signal for his most comprehensive contingency plan. Anakin received the news of the broadcast contingency while sheltering with the surviving Jedi Masters in a location beneath Coruscant's industrial sector. The response from the military had been absolute and immediate. The clone army had mobilized not just against the Jedi, but against Senate authority. The government was fragmenting, and the broader galaxy was beginning to erupt in coordinated uprisings that suggested Sith coordination on a scale that no single individual was supposed to be capable of achieving. "He planned for his own death," Obi-Wan said quietly, understanding crystallizing. "He orchestrated this entire sequence of events knowing he would be killed, knowing that his death would trigger responses that would destabilize the Republic, knowing that his contingencies would execute while attention was focused on immediate crisis. The question becomes," Mace Windu said, "whether his death actually accomplished anything, whether eliminating Palpatine in that moment was strategic victory, or whether it was simply accelerating timeline that was going to unfold regardless." Anakin was very still. Understanding was forming in his consciousness, with the specific weight of realization that comes when the full scope of manipulation becomes clear. "It accomplished clarity," Anakin said finally. "Palpatine's death forced the conspiracy into open. It forced the contingencies to activate visibly, rather than operating in shadow. It transformed hidden manipulation into direct conflict, where responses are possible. At the cost of the temple," Ki-Adi-Mundi said, "at the cost of military structure that was supposed to protect the Republic, at the cost of government stability that was never actually real, but which at least maintained semblance of order." "Yes," Anakin agreed, "but that cost was coming regardless. Palpatine's plan was designed to unfold over the next months, whether I killed him or not. The only variable my action changed was making the unfolding happen immediately rather than gradually, making the crisis visible rather than allowing it to develop in shadows." Yoda, ancient and exhausted, looked at Anakin with expression that carried something like approval mixed with profound sadness. "Correct about immediate tactical situation you were," Yoda said, "but understand also, you must. The victory you achieved was measured in clearing one obstacle. The war that follows will be measured in years. Accept this, you must, as cost of clarity that you purchased with Palpatine's death." The reports came in cascading waves across the first 72 hours after Palpatine's death contingencies activated. The Outer Rim sectors were erupting into coordinated uprisings, not random rebellion, but systematic military action that suggested Sith coordination at scales that the intelligence networks were still struggling to comprehend. Separatist remnants that had been dormant were activating in synchronized patterns. Corporate fleets that had maintained neutrality were moving toward positions of military advantage. Worlds that had been stable were fragmenting into civil conflict as Sith agents positioned decades ago began moving into positions of power. The Clone Army, fractured by Order 66 activation but still maintaining coherence as military force, was attempting to consolidate control over the core worlds. The military command structure that had been unified under Palpatine's direction was becoming increasingly incoherent as different commanders received conflicting instructions and began moving toward consolidation of power in their individual sectors. The Senate, which had always functioned as check on executive power, discovered suddenly, and with shock, that it had never actually possessed the power to enforce its own authority. The government of the Republic, which had seemed monolithic and unchangeable, was revealed to be structure maintained entirely through Palpatine's personal dominance and careful manipulation of institutional power. And the Jedi Order, which had been slowly integrated into government over the past decades, discovered that having accepted such integration meant they were blamed for governmental failure while simultaneously being denied authority to actually address the failure. Anakin stood in the operations chamber where the surviving Jedi Masters were attempting to coordinate response, and he understood with absolute clarity what his choice had actually accomplished. Not clarity, not liberation, catastrophe. "We have received reports of separatist forces moving toward the Outer Rim," a communications officer reported. "Military analysts suggest they are attempting to establish position of strength before the military finishes consolidating control over core worlds. If they succeed, the galaxy will fracture into 3 competing power structures: military government in core worlds, separatist control in Outer Rim, and fragmenting Senate authority in mid-rim territories. How long until that fracture becomes permanent?" Mace Windu demanded. "Weeks," the officer replied. "Perhaps months. But once the fracture occurs, reversing it will require military action at scales that would devastate civilian populations across dozens of worlds." Obi-Wan looked at Anakin, and the expression in his eyes communicated something that went beyond disappointment or anger. It communicated understanding of catastrophic mistake being recognized too late to prevent its consequences. "You killed the Sith Lord," Obi-Wan said, and his voice was perfectly controlled but carried weight that suggested enormous effort to maintain that control. "You eliminated the conspiracy's apex, and in doing so, you activated contingencies that are now unfolding exactly as the Sith Lord designed them to unfold." "I understand," Anakin replied. "Do you?" Mace demanded, stepping forward with the expression of someone who was holding back rage through pure force discipline. "Do you actually understand that your choice to act on clarity has resulted in military takeover of the government? That your choice has resulted in Jedi Temple being destroyed? That your choice has fractured the Republic in ways that might not be repaired for generations?" "Yes," Anakin said simply. "I understand that my choice had consequences that I did not anticipate. I understand that Palpatine planned for his own death. I understand that I accelerated a timeline that was going to unfold regardless. And I understand that this understanding does not change the fact that Palpatine was threat that needed to be eliminated." "But was he?" Yoda asked quietly, and the question carried something that suggested the ancient master was asking himself as much as asking Anakin. "Eliminate the threat, you did. But create new threats, you have, that may be more dangerous than the original threat, because they are distributed, because they lack single point of control, because they cannot be addressed through eliminating single individual." Ki Adi Mundi was analyzing strategic situation with the focus of someone who understood military mathematics. "The military will consolidate control within the month. The separatists will establish independence within 6 weeks. The Senate will attempt negotiation, but will discover that they have no actual authority. Within 3 months, the Republic as political entity will effectively cease to exist. It will be replaced by competing military power structures that may or may not decide to maintain hostility. Then we move to prevent that outcome, Anakin said, understanding suddenly what needed to happen. We move against the clone army immediately. We disable Order 66 across all remaining forces. We prevent military consolidation before it becomes unassailable. And accomplish what? Mace demanded. Eliminate the military threat and leave the Separatists in position to achieve complete independence? Transform this into 3-way conflict instead of 2-way conflict? Then we move against the Separatists simultaneously, Anakin replied. We use Jedi capabilities to prevent consolidation across all factions before any of them become sufficiently powerful to dominate. We fragment power structures to point where negotiation becomes only viable option. Obi-Wan understood what Anakin was proposing. It was strategy that would require Jedi Order to move against multiple fronts simultaneously, that would stretch already thin Jedi resources to breaking point, that would likely result in significant Jedi casualties. It was also the only strategy that had any possibility of preventing complete governmental collapse. It would require us to abandon defensive posture, Ki-Adi-Mundi said, understanding the implications. It would require us to become aggressive military force rather than supporting institution. It would transform the Jedi from what we have always been into what Palpatine always wanted us to become. Military power pursuing political objectives. Yes, Anakin acknowledged, but the alternative is watching the Republic fragment and civilian populations suffer consequences of multiple competing military powers fighting for dominance. We can choose to remain pure and allow catastrophe, or we can choose to act and accept the costs of that action. Yoda was very still for a long moment. The ancient master was contemplating choice that the Jedi had always sworn to avoid: direct military intervention in governance without civilian authorization. Propose you are that we become exactly what Palpatine feared, Yoda said finally. Military power above civilian authority. Jedi making strategic decisions based on force capability rather than civilian mandate. I propose that we become necessary, Anakin replied, that we make ourselves essential to preventing complete collapse, and then we use that essential position to transition authority back to civilian control once the immediate crisis is resolved. And if civilian control never emerges, Mace demanded, if the Jedi become accustomed to exercising military power, if the necessity to take control becomes permanent feature rather than temporary crisis response, then we will have failed, Anakin said. But we will fail while attempting to prevent catastrophe rather than failing through inaction. And there is difference between those two failures. Obi-Wan made decision that would transform his relationship with Anakin forever. Then we move, Obi-Wan announced. We coordinate with the military forces that are opposed to consolidation. We work with Senate allies to prevent complete military takeover. We move toward separatist territories to prevent consolidation there. We fragment power structures before any single faction becomes unassailable. And we accept that doing this transforms us in ways we may not fully understand until we look back on this moment years from now. The other masters understood what was being communicated. They were moving beyond the Jedi Order's traditional role. They were moving into territory that the Jedi had always said they would never willingly enter, and they were doing it because the alternative was worse. The first engagement happened in the Outer Rim, where Anakin led coordinated strike against Separatist consolidation. The Separatist forces were still disorganized. They had lost Dooku's leadership years ago and had been operating without clear command structure ever since. The sudden coordinated assault from Jedi forces that were operating with military authority they had never possessed before caught them in moment of maximum vulnerability. The engagement was brief but decisive. Anakin and his strike team moved through Separatist positions with speed that prevented coordination, that prevented escape, that resulted in destruction of military capability that the Separatists had been consolidating. The droid forces fell, not because they were inferior, but because they were facing an opponent who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from swift victory. Simultaneously, across the core worlds, Mace Windu led operation against clone force consolidation. The clone troopers were programmed for absolute obedience to military command structure, but Mace's forces did not attempt traditional military engagement. Instead, they systematically dismantled clone command centers, disabled communications networks, prevented coordination between different clone battalions. The operation was not designed to destroy the clone army, but to fragment it into disconnected pieces that could not execute unified strategy. In the Mid-Rim territories, Obi-Wan coordinated with Senate allied forces to prevent complete military fragmentation. The work was different from pure military engagement. It was negotiation, positioning, political maneuvering designed to prevent power vacuum from being filled by any single faction. It was work that required understanding of governance and political consequence in ways that pure military training did not provide. But it was necessary work. Within 2 weeks, the cascade of Jedi military action had produced unexpected result. The 3 competing power structures had been prevented from consolidating. The clone army was fragmented. The separatist forces were scattered. The military's attempt to consolidate complete control had been disrupted, but the Republic was not saved. The Republic had simply transformed into different configuration. Instead of single unified government, instead of clear military consolidation, instead of separatist independence, the galaxy now existed in state of managed chaos, where multiple factions maintained rough equilibrium through mutual fear of any single faction becoming too powerful. It was not peace. It was not stability. It was simply configuration where open warfare was prevented through balance of power rather than through central authority. Anakin stood in command center, where the Jedi were attempting to coordinate further operations, and he understood what he had actually accomplished. Not victory, not defeat. Transformation into something that was not better or worse, but simply different. A galaxy where power was distributed rather than concentrated, where government was fragmented rather than unified, where the Jedi Order had been forced to become military power rather than spiritual institution. Yoda appeared beside him, the ancient master moving with the exhaustion that came from understanding consequences over decades that Anakin was only beginning to comprehend. "Understand now, do you?" Yoda asked quietly. "What clarity accomplished? What elimination of single Sith Lord has transformed the galaxy into?" "A place where no single faction can dominate," Anakin replied. "Where power is distributed, where the Jedi are no longer advisors to central authority, but are instead necessity for maintaining balance." "And satisfied are you with this outcome?" Yoda asked. Anakin did not answer immediately. He was considering the question with the specific weight that came from understanding that his answer would define what he believed about his own choice. "No," Anakin said finally, "but I am more satisfied with this outcome than with the alternative, where Palpatine's conspiracy unfolded successfully and the Jedi Order was eliminated simultaneously across the galaxy. Palpatine's death did not save the Republic, but it did prevent the Republic from being destroyed in the specific way that Palpatine had designed for its destruction." Yoda nodded slowly, and the gesture communicated something like acceptance of impossible truth. "Then perhaps," the ancient master said, "clarity was sufficient. Not sufficient to create desired outcome, not sufficient to prevent all catastrophe, but sufficient to prevent specific catastrophe that Sith Lord had orchestrated. And in galaxy, where perfect outcomes are impossible, sometimes preventing specific disasters is closest we can come to victory." 5 years after Palpatine's death, the Republic had become something that no one would have anticipated. It was not collapsed. It was not transformed into dictatorship. It was simply fragmented into sustainable pieces that maintained rough equilibrium through mutual understanding that none of them could dominate the others without devastating costs. The core worlds maintained military government under commanders who had rejected complete takeover and instead accepted role as administrators managing specific regions. The Outer Rim had achieved de facto independence under various local governments that maintained only nominal connection to central authority. The Mid-Rim had become zone of negotiation where Senate-affiliated worlds maintained civilian government and served as neutral space where competing factions could negotiate without mutual destruction. It was not the Republic that had existed before Palpatine's rise. It was not the galaxy that anyone had wanted to create, but it was sustainable, and in context of galactic politics, sustainability was victory of sorts. Anakin was teaching a group of young Padawans in the reconstructed Jedi Temple when word came of the final treaty signing. The treaty was between the three regional governments, formal acknowledgement that the galaxy was no longer unified, that the Republic, as centralized political entity, had effectively ceased to exist, that governance would henceforth be distributed across multiple competing authorities that had learned to coexist without attempting mutual destruction. The Padawans, who had been born after Palpatine's death or who had only dim memories of the temple before its destruction, asked the question that younger generations always asked of those who had lived through the transformation. "Master, are we winning?" Anakin set down the meditation stone he had been holding and considered the question with the specific weight that 5 years of living with consequences had taught him. The question of winning assumes that there is opponent to be defeated. Anakin replied, 5 years ago, there was opponent. Palpatine was clearly identifiable threat. I eliminated that threat. But elimination of threat does not equal victory. It equals creation of new configuration where previous certainties no longer apply. So you regret your choice? One of the younger Padawans asked. No, Anakin said directly. I regret consequences that I did not anticipate. I regret that my clarity about immediate threat resulted in catastrophe that I did not foresee. But I do not regret the choice itself, because the alternative, allowing Palpatine to continue orchestrating his conspiracy, would have resulted in different catastrophe. Not better or worse, simply different. He stood and moved toward the window where the reconstructed temple overlooked Coruscant's transformed skyline. The Republic as it existed is gone, Anakin continued. That is fact that cannot be changed. Palpatine's death did not save the Republic, but it did prevent the Jedi Order from being eliminated alongside the Republic. It forced contingencies to activate in ways that became visible rather than remaining hidden, and it created a situation where governance had to distribute itself across multiple factions because no single faction could gain complete dominance. Is distributed governance better than unified governance? Another Padawan asked. Sometimes, Anakin replied, unified governance under just leader can accomplish tremendous good efficiently. Distributed governance under competing leaders is inefficient and frustrating, and requires constant negotiation. But unified governance under unjust leader is catastrophe, while distributed governance at least ensures that no single leader can become so absolute that they cannot be challenged. I chose distributed governance. I did not choose it because I believed it was ideal. I chose it because it was preferable to alternative. Obi-Wan found Anakin in the temple's meditation garden that evening. The garden was being reconstructed. The Jedi had decided to preserve some of the damage from the clone assault rather than repair everything completely, using the damaged sections as reminder of what catastrophe looked like, as testimony to what happened when institutions believed themselves unassailable and therefore failed to prepare for assault. Yoda wanted me to speak with you, Obi-Wan said, settling onto meditation stone beside Anakin. He believes that the treaty signing represents moment where you should formally acknowledge your role in the current configuration. My role was killing Palpatine, Anakin replied. Everything that has followed has been consequence of that single action, not intention on my part. Precisely, Obi-Wan said, which is why Yoda believes you need to formally acknowledge that you have accepted responsibility for those consequences, not apologetically, not as if you regret the killing itself, but as acknowledgement that clarity about one problem does not grant you authority to ignore consequences of that clarity. Anakin was quiet for a long moment. "I have spent 5 years watching the galaxy fragment," Anakin said finally. "I have spent 5 years understanding that my choice to act based on immediate threat resulted in catastrophe I could not anticipate. And I have spent 5 years accepting that this understanding does not change the fact that Palpatine needed to be eliminated. The contradiction between those two understandings has been difficult. That contradiction is the heart of leadership," Obi-Wan replied. "Understanding that the right choice can result in wrong consequences. Understanding that clarity about immediate threat does not grant you clarity about larger systems. Understanding that you can be correct about what needs to happen and completely wrong about what will happen as a result." "How do you live with that understanding?" Anakin asked. "By continuing to make choices," Obi-Wan replied. "By accepting that the alternative to making choices is abdication of responsibility. By understanding that no choice is free from consequence, and that therefore the question is not whether to choose, but whether you are willing to accept responsibility for consequences of your choice." The ceremony that followed the treaty signing took place in the reconstructed council chamber. Yoda, now approaching 1,000 years of age and moving with the exhaustion that came from having guided the Jedi through multiple transformations across centuries, formally addressed Anakin before the assembled masters. "Acknowledge your choice. We do," Yoda said, his voice carrying authority that suggested the words were being said not simply to Anakin, but to all of history. "Correct. Your choice was about immediate threat. But understand also, you must, that your choice transformed the galaxy in ways that extend far beyond your intention or anticipation." "I accept this responsibility," Anakin replied, and the words carried weight that suggested he was speaking not just to the assembled masters, but to himself, to his own conscience, to the understanding of consequence that 5 years had taught him. "Then accept also, you must, that you cannot simply eliminate future threats and expect that elimination to solve problems," Yoda continued. "Learned you have, through consequence of your action, that clarity about what needs to happen does not equal clarity about what will happen as a result. Carry this understanding forward, you must, as you continue to serve the Order and the galaxy." "I will," Anakin confirmed. As the sun set over Coruscant's transformed cityscape, Anakin stood alone in the meditation garden and allowed himself to contemplate what his choice had actually accomplished. He had killed a Sith Lord who was a threat to the Jedi and to the Republic. That much was straightforward. That much was correct. That much he would do again if faced with identical circumstances. But he had also triggered a cascade of events that fragmented the Republic's unified government. He had forced the Jedi to become military power rather than spiritual institution. He had created a situation where power was distributed across competing factions that maintained rough equilibrium through mutual fear rather than through central authority. These consequences were not consequences he had chosen, but they were consequences of his choice. And in accepting responsibility for those consequences, not apologetically, not as if they were wrong, but simply as acknowledgement that clarity about immediate threat does not grant clarity about larger systems, Anakin had learned something that no amount of training could have taught. Sometimes the right choice results in wrong consequences. Sometimes clarity is purchased at the cost of catastrophe. Sometimes clarity is sufficient anyway. In a hidden location in the Outer Rim, in a facility that had been prepared decades ago but never activated, consciousness that had been preserved in backup format began to reconstitute itself. Palpatine's contingency was not simply military action. Palpatine's contingency included his own preservation, consciousness backed up in formats that could be recovered if the body was destroyed, positioned in locations that could activate automatically if specific conditions were met. The consciousness that was reconstituting understood what had happened, understood that its primary body had been killed, understood that the contingencies had activated as designed, understood that the galaxy was now configured exactly as it had been designed to be configured. The Sith Lord's plan had succeeded not through his survival, but through ensuring that his death activated mechanisms that would continue his work regardless of his personal destruction. The universe was fracturing. Power was distributing across competing factions. The Jedi had been forced to become military authority. Everything was proceeding according to design. And in the next chapter of the galaxy's history, the reconstituted consciousness would emerge to take advantage of the chaos that Anakin Skywalker had triggered through his choice to act on clarity. But Anakin did not know this yet. Anakin stood in the meditation garden as darkness fell over Coruscant, and he allowed himself to believe, at least for this moment, that his choice had been sufficient, that clarity about immediate threat had been enough, that killing Palpatine had been the right action even if the consequences had been unpredictable. The Padawans would ask him for years to come whether his choice had been right, whether he regretted his actions, whether he would do it differently if given opportunity to choose again. And Anakin would tell them honestly that he did not regret the choice itself, but he did regret the consequences that he could not anticipate, that sometimes clarity is purchased at cost of catastrophe, that sometimes doing the right thing results in wrong outcomes, that the universe is more complex than clarity can account for, and that understanding this truth, accepting it, living with it, continuing to make choices despite it, was what separated leaders who actually understood responsibility from leaders who simply exercised power. The garden was silent except for sound of water flowing through reconstructed fountains. The temple that had been destroyed was being rebuilt. The Jedi Order that had been transformed was learning to function as something new. And the galaxy that had been fragmented by clarity was learning to exist as a collection of competing powers maintained in rough equilibrium through mutual understanding that none of them could dominate without devastating costs. It was not the outcome Anakin would have chosen. It was not the galaxy he had intended to create. But it was the galaxy that his clarity had brought into being, and he would spend the rest of his life living with the consequences of that clarity, teaching others what clarity actually cost, ensuring that future generations understood that the right choice was not always the choice that resulted in right outcome, that sometimes clarity was sufficient anyway, and that was enough.